The first snow of the season came earlier than expected in Alder Creek. It arrived silently in the night, blanketing the hills, barns, and winding fences in a soft sheet of white. When Thomas Granger stepped out onto his porch that morning, coffee mug in hand, the air held that sharp, metallic cold that only mountain winters could carry. "Too early for this," he muttered, pulling his worn flannel tighter. Behind him, the screen door creaked as it closed. At his side stood Remy, his 10-year-old German shepherd, alert and still, despite the snow clinging to his thick fur. "Go on then," Thomas said, nodding toward the lower pasture. "Check the fence line." Remy didn't need to be told twice. He bounded off through the snow, strong legs cutting a clear trail toward the sheep pen. It was their routine. Remy made a loop around the fields, while Thomas filled water troughs and scattered feed. The two of them had worked this land together for nearly a decade, ever since Thomas left the search and rescue service and buried his grief here after losing Marlene. But this morning felt off. By the time Thomas finished his tasks and looked toward the tree line, Remy had not returned. Usually he was back within 15 minutes, tongue lolling, ready for breakfast. "Remy!" Thomas called, voice echoing over the quiet valley. No sound came back, no bark, no crunch of paws over snow. His chest tightened. He knew better than most that dogs didn't vanish without reason. He threw on his coat, tucked a flashlight into one pocket, and a leather leash into the other. The snow had stopped falling, leaving a muted world where every sound was amplified. His boots crunching, the wind stirring frozen pine branches. Following Remy's tracks through the snow was easy at first. The deep imprints led away from the barn, past the creek that had started to freeze, and into the woods beyond. As he entered the forest, the air changed. It grew darker under the evergreens, and the snow became patchier underfoot. The tracks continued, but with less clarity. Branches scratched at his sleeves, and twice he had to stop to catch his breath. At 67, his body no longer moved with the same urgency it once had, but his instincts remained sharp. Then, a sound. A bark. But it wasn't Remy's usual alert call. It was urgent, high-pitched, threaded with anxiety. Thomas picked up his pace, heart pounding. He pushed past a snow-covered thicket and stumbled into a small clearing where a large pine tree had fallen, its massive roots yanked from the earth like a broken tooth. Remy stood near the exposed roots, pacing, ears back. He let out another short bark and glanced over his shoulder at Thomas, then returned his attention to something under the tree. Thomas slowed his steps. "What is it, boy?" As he moved closer, he saw it, tucked into a hollow beneath the lifted roots, half buried in snow and leaves, was a wild animal, a bobcat. It was a young female, barely more than a juvenile. Her coat was mottled with dirt and dried blood. One of her hind legs stuck out at an awkward angle, swollen and raw with an open wound. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as she pressed herself back into the shadows, golden eyes locked onto the man approaching. Thomas froze. 1,000 instincts kicked in. Training, caution, the knowledge that a wounded wildcat was dangerous. But then he looked at Remy, who wasn't growling or barking anymore. The big shepherd had laid down in the snow, head low between his paws, eyes fixed on the bobcat. Not in threat, in understanding. "You serious?" Thomas whispered. The bobcat hissed softly, but didn't lunge. She stayed curled in her little hollow, trembling with pain and fear. Thomas looked back at Remy. The dog had seen years of wilderness rescue missions, floods, wildfires, even avalanches. He had tracked lost hikers and comforted grieving families, and never, not once, had he hesitated or misread a situation. If Remy said she wasn't a threat, Thomas would believe him. "All right," he said under his breath. "We'll do this your way." He crouched slowly, removing his coat. The cold bit into his arms as he held the fabric like a shield, speaking gently. "Easy now. I'm just trying to help." Remy stayed where he was, making soft, whimpering sounds. With a practiced motion, Thomas tossed the coat over the Bobcat and quickly bundled her up. She thrashed weakly, but the fight had left her. Lifting her gently, Thomas could feel every rib, every heartbeat, fast and fragile beneath her fur. As he trudged back through the snow, Remy walked beside him, tail low, gaze constantly checking on the bundle in Thomas's arms. They reached the barn. It still held some warmth from the heater Thomas used during lambing season. He placed the Bobcat in an old kennel lined with straw, then knelt beside her. "You're lucky," he murmured. "My dog's got a softer heart than most people I know." He washed the wound gently with warm water, applied ointment from his vet kit, and covered it with gauze. The Bobcat, barely conscious now, watched him with glassy eyes, but didn't resist. Remy sat outside the kennel, watching silently. That night, Thomas sat in the barn with them. The wind howled outside. Snow blew against the windows. Inside, it was quiet, warm, still. He looked at the Bobcat, curled under the coat, and at Remy, who hadn't moved from his post. "Well," Thomas said softly, "guess we're not alone anymore." And in that moment, under the amber light of a hanging bulb, surrounded by hay and the hum of the old heater, a strange kind of peace settled over them. A man, a dog, and a wounded wild soul, each carrying something broken, each finding something unexpected. The first chapter in a story none of them could have foreseen had just begun. The storm rolled in that night like a curtain being drawn over the world. Winds howled across the hills, blowing snow sideways, piling drifts against the barn door. Inside, the old space was dimly lit, the air warm with the hum of a small heater and the scent of straw and antiseptic. The Bobcat lay in the kennel, wrapped in Thomas's coat, unmoving except for the slow, rhythmic rise of her chest. Thomas sat on an overturned bucket, sipping lukewarm coffee from a tin mug, watching both the animal and the dog beside her. "I suppose we'll need to call you something," he murmured. "Can't keep calling you her." He studied the feline. Though thin and injured, she held an undeniable grace, like smoke given form. Her spotted coat, streaked with mud, still shimmered faintly in the light. Her ears twitched at the sound of his voice. "Ashra," he said softly. "Ashra it is." The name had no particular origin. It had simply arrived, like the snowstorm itself, uninvited, but somehow fitting. Ashra didn't react, but the name stuck in his mind. She was no ordinary wild animal, not anymore. Remy shifted beside the kennel, setting his chin on his paws. Every so often, he let out a quiet whine, as if to reassure Ashra that she wasn't alone. She never growled at him. She didn't hiss. That was what puzzled Thomas most of all. Back when he worked search and rescue in Alberta, he'd seen wildcats snarl and flee at the scent of a dog. But this was different. It was as if they recognized something in each other. Shared ground, perhaps, between predator and protector. The next morning, Thomas opened the barn door and found the snow nearly up to his knees. The path to the road had vanished beneath a thick white veil. He tried the landline. Dead. The satellite internet? Outside. No weather update. No calls to the local wildlife service. No way out for now. "Looks like it's just us, girl," he said to Ashra. Every morning became a ritual. Thomas would boil water on the old stove in the house, then carry it out to the barn. He cleaned Ashra's wound with practiced care, talking to her the entire time. "Not much different than treating a lamb," he'd joke, "except the lamb doesn't have fangs and a death stare." Ashra never lashed out. She watched him with steady, measuring eyes, flinching only when he touched the deepest part of the wound. And through it all, Remy remained by her side, sometimes even nudging Thomas when the man was too slow or too rough. Days passed. Ashra began to eat more. Thomas fed her cooked chicken and bits of ground beef, soft food that didn't strain her healing body. Slowly, strength returned to her limbs. She began to sit up. One afternoon, she stood. It was a shaky, uncertain rise, but it made Thomas pause mid-task. "You're a fighter," he whispered. Remy wagged his tail softly, watching Ashra intently. Then, in an unexpected gesture, he trotted off into the shadows of the barn and returned dragging an old toy, an orange rubber ball chewed half to oblivion. He dropped it in front of the kennel. Ashra blinked. She didn't pounce. She didn't sniff. But that night, Thomas returned to find the ball tucked neatly inside the kennel, next to the coat. By the end of the week, Ashra began approaching the kennel door when Thomas entered. She stretched more often, grooming herself like a cat, readying for a return to pride. Her wound, while still tender, was healing cleanly. The swelling had gone down. She no longer cowered in the back of the cage. Thomas knew it was time. With Remy at his side, he unlatched the kennel door. Ashra didn't bolt. She stepped out slowly, paws silent on the straw. Her golden eyes flicked to Thomas, then to Remy. The dog remained still, tail sweeping softly behind him. The barn was hers now to explore. She walked its length, sniffing feed sacks, scratching once at a hay bale, and hopping onto a low beam with surprising agility for a cat who'd been close to death a week earlier. Remy followed, not intrusively, but like a shadow, steady, watchful. That evening, with wind still rattling the shutters, Thomas did something he'd never imagined. He opened the kitchen door. Ashra hesitated at the threshold. She stood there, framed by the glow of the porch light and the falling snow, ears forward, muscles tensed. Remy walked past her, into the warm kitchen, and leapt up into his usual armchair beside the fireplace. Ashra watched him. Then she stepped inside. It was a slow, deliberate crossing. Her claws clicked on the wooden floor. She sniffed the rug, the base of the sofa, and then, ignoring Thomas entirely, she leapt up into the armchair with Remy. They didn't touch, not at first. But within minutes, Ashra curled against the curve of the dog's back, her breathing steady, her eyes half-lidded. Thomas sat down at the table, staring. "If Marlene could see this," he whispered, the old ache in his chest rising like smoke, "she'd laugh me right out of my boots." But he couldn't laugh. He couldn't even speak. He just sat there, listening to the storm outside, watching a wild cat and an old dog sleep together in a chair by the fire. Two creatures that should have been enemies, but weren't. That night, as he turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to bed, Thomas glanced back one last time. The fire had died to embers. Remy's tail twitched once in his sleep. Ashra stirred, but didn't move away. And in that fragile silence, under one humble roof in the middle of a snow-locked forest, something remarkable was beginning to take root. Something wild, something real, something that no storm could bury. When the wind finally calmed and the snow softened under the early light of day, Thomas stepped out onto the porch with his usual mug of coffee and found that the world had become still again. The sky above Alder Creek was a pale blue, and the pine trees shimmered like sentinels dusted in powdered sugar. The storm had passed, but its presence lingered in knee-deep snowbanks and broken tree limbs. Inside the house, things had changed too. Ashra had claimed her spot in the armchair, not just borrowed it, claimed it. Thomas found her there every morning, curled tightly in the cushions where Remy usually slept, her yellow eyes blinking lazily as the fire warmed her fur. Remy didn't seem to mind. He had moved to the rug in front of the hearth and lay with his head resting on his paws, always half watching her, always near. Thomas shook his head every time he saw them. One morning, while ladling out oats to the sheep in the back pasture, he caught himself smiling without realizing it. He looked toward the barn and saw her. Ashra stood at the edge of the snow-covered pen, her figure silhouetted against the light. She wasn't stalking, she wasn't threatening, she was simply watching. The sheep, sensing her presence, bleated once, then returned to grazing. No panic, no stampede. It made no sense. Bobcats didn't coexist with livestock. But Ashra, she wasn't behaving like any wildcat he had known or read about. She seemed to have accepted the rhythms of the farm, of them. That night, Thomas scribbled a note in his weathered journal. Ashra watched over the flock. No fear from the sheep, no aggression from her. This isn't survival anymore. This is something else. Over the following days, a pattern developed. Thomas would step outside each morning with Remy. Ashra would trail them, walking silently through the snow, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind. She explored the tree line, climbing boulders, watching birds, but never straying far. Every evening, without fail, she returned, never coaxed, never caged. She chose to come back. Thomas began leaving the barn door ajar. By the end of the second week, she no longer needed the kennel. She slept on the porch or in the living room, always near Remy. When he napped, she curled beside him. When he played in the snow, she chased him, her gait returning to its wild elegance. One afternoon, while Thomas repaired a fence post near the creek, he paused to stretch and found Remy crouched behind a bush, eyes fixed forward. Ashra was nearby, still as a statue. On the other side of the clearing, a red fox crept forward, nose twitching, unaware. In a coordinated flash, Remy barked sharply once and lunged left, while Ashra darted right, her movements fast and fluid. The fox froze, startled, then darted back into the forest. It was a move Thomas had only ever seen between two trained dogs. A herding pattern. They had done it without a sound, without a signal. Together. He walked back to the cabin that evening, feeling the weight of a truth that had been building quietly. Ashra wasn't a guest anymore. She was part of the team. But with that truth came something darker. Fear. Thomas had been putting off the call for days, maybe weeks. Deep snow had initially made contact impossible, but now roads were opening, and the satellite dish was working again. He couldn't pretend forever. Keeping a wild bobcat was illegal, no matter how extraordinary the situation. That night, as the fire crackled and the two animals lay quietly nearby, Thomas picked up the phone. His fingers hovered over the buttons, hesitating. In the end, he didn't call the authorities. He called his son. James Granger answered on the third ring. "Dad, you all right?" "Yeah," Thomas said, voice low. "But I need to talk to you about something. Something strange." He explained everything, from the storm to the discovery in the forest, from the injury to the bond, from the healing to the partnership now unfolding before him like a quiet miracle. James didn't interrupt, not once. When Thomas finished, There was a pause. Then, "And you're sure she's not dangerous?" "She sleeps in your mother's chair," Thomas said. "She guards the sheep with Remy. I don't know how else to explain it." James sighed. "I might know someone. A friend of mine works with the Rocky Hollow Conservation Center. They've dealt with rewilding and animal rehabilitation. Maybe there's an exception they can make." Thomas nodded, even though James couldn't see him. "I'd appreciate that. I'll call them tomorrow." "Thanks, son." Thomas hung up, feeling both lighter and more vulnerable than he had in years. He looked at Ashra and Remy, still curled together by the fire. They didn't know about regulations, paperwork, or public perception. They just knew what they were, together. The next morning, as if sensing something was shifting, Ashra didn't follow them to the field. She sat on the porch, tail twitching, eyes on the horizon. Thomas stood beside her. "Change is coming," he murmured. Ashra didn't move. She just watched. And for the first time since that snow-covered morning in the woods, Thomas felt the fragile weight of what they'd built together. Not just shelter or recovery, but trust, wild and rare as the animal beside him. A pact, unspoken, but real. The news came on a Thursday morning, just as the fog lifted off the pasture and the last patches of snow melted into spring mud. James called, his voice carrying a cautious optimism. "They want to meet her." Thomas leaned against the fence post, one boot resting on the lower rail. Remy sat beside him, alert as always, while Ashra paced the length of the barn roof like a silent shadow. "The conservation team?" Thomas asked. "Yeah, Rocky Hollow's senior wildlife director, Dr. Elena Craig. She saw the photos I sent. She says it's unprecedented." Thomas chuckled dryly. "That's one word for it." "They're not coming to take her," James said, anticipating the tension. "They're interested in studying her, what this bond means. They want to observe. Offer you a special permit, Dad. Conditional, but legal. You'd keep her. She'd stay." Thomas exhaled slowly, gaze still fixed on Ashra as she leapt gracefully from the roof to a fence post, then down into the pasture where the sheep grazed. The animals didn't startle. They barely looked up anymore. "You tell them yes," he said quietly. "They're welcome here." Dr. Elena Craig and her team arrived a week later. 3 vehicles wound up the gravel drive, parking beside Thomas's barn. A woman in her 40s with gray streaked hair tied back under a ball cap and field notes in hand stepped out first. Behind her were 2 young interns, a cameraman and a wildlife behavioral specialist. Ashra was already watching from the edge of the barn roof, eyes narrowed, tail flicking. "She's beautiful," Elena said in awe, "and calm." "She wasn't always," Thomas replied. But Remy had a different idea. Remy approached the newcomers politely, tail wagging but cautious. He stopped beside Thomas, casting a quick glance toward Ashra, his silent way of checking. "Is this all right?" Ashra, after a moment, leapt down and padded toward them, not close, but near enough to be seen. "Is she free roaming?" Elena asked, amazed. "She's never been tethered," Thomas said. "She comes back every night because she wants to." The next few days unfolded like a strange dream. The team stayed in the small guest house on the edge of the property. They set up observation cameras, logged behaviors, interviewed Thomas about every moment of the story, starting with the day Remy vanished into the storm and found the injured Bobcat. What stunned the researchers most was not just the peaceful coexistence between predator and protector, but the subtle language they had developed. The ways Ashra would copy Remy's movements. The way Remy deferred space when she signaled discomfort. The mutual understanding invisible to anyone not watching closely. On the third evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills, Elena turned her camera off and said, "I've seen wolves and dogs form bonds. I've seen foxes raised with cats. But this is something else." That weekend, a filmmaker named Leslie Chen arrived to document the story. At first, Thomas bristled. He had never wanted this to be a show. His life had always been quiet: soil, silence, service. But James had convinced him that the story could help people, could teach something. So he agreed. The documentary team filmed Ashra and Remy walking together through the woods. They caught the moment Ashra crouched low in the grass, while Remy stood guard beside the lamb pen. They filmed them curled up on the porch at dusk, touching but not tangled, like bookends to a chapter no one had written before. They filmed Thomas too, quietly at first, asking how he felt, what he had learned. He thought long and hard before answering. "They don't see the labels," he said finally. "Dog, bobcat, predator, pet. That's our thinking, not theirs." Remy saw a soul that needed help. Ashra saw someone she could trust. That's it. Simple as that. The documentary, titled "Where Loyalty Meets the Wild," aired nationally 2 months later. Viewers across Canada, the US, and the UK watched in astonishment as scenes of frost, firelight, and fur played out over haunting piano music and Thomas's calm narration. Letters poured in. Schools requested visits. Wildlife centers called to study the footage. But Thomas didn't let it change him, or them. Ashra still returned at dusk. Remy still dozed under the oak tree. Life continued, just as it had before the cameras, before the headlines. And to Thomas, that was the true miracle. Not the attention, but the unchanged devotion between them. By early summer, something remarkable happened. One morning, Thomas noticed Ashra not returning after her usual dawn patrol. He wasn't concerned. She'd been ranging further lately, growing restless. But 3 days later, she returned. Not alone. Tucked beneath her belly were 3 tiny kittens, eyes barely open, mewling, legs wobbling. Ashra led them directly into the barn and disappeared behind the hay bales where she had once hidden from death. Remy watched her go, then turned to Thomas with a look that said, "This is just the beginning." Over the following weeks, Ashra allowed no one near the nest, except Remy. He lay at the mouth of the barn like a sentinel, ears perked, growling low when crows came too close. Even Thomas, who had nursed her back to life, was only permitted fleeting glances at the kittens. But he didn't mind. Some things, he understood, belonged to the wild. They only ever borrowed themselves to you, and only if you proved worthy. The conservation team returned to record this unexpected development. Elena was stunned. A wild bobcat choosing to give birth on a human farm, it's unheard of. "And yet," Thomas said, watching Remy nuzzle one of the kittens gently, "here we are." By the end of summer, the kittens were playing on the grass beside the porch, tumbling over Remy's massive paws, swiping at moths in the evening air. Ashra stayed close but relaxed, never anxious, never possessive. She knew her cubs were safe. And Thomas, once again, sat on the steps, coffee in hand, heart fuller than it had been in decades. The years moved quietly over Alder Creek like falling snow. Soft, steady, unnoticed, until you looked back and saw how much had changed. The documentary faded from headlines. The researchers came less frequently. The letters stopped arriving. But the bond remained. Ashra's kittens grew strong. When they were old enough, one by one, they slipped into the forest, finding dens of their own. Yet, like their mother before them, they never disappeared entirely. Thomas would spot them now and then, on a ridge at sunset, drinking from the creek, watching the sheep from afar. Sometimes they returned with their own cubs, cautious but unafraid. Ashra stayed. She roamed further now, but every night she returned to the ranch, curling on the porch beside Remy or sleeping in her favorite armchair near the hearth. She never lost her wildness, but neither did she forget where she was first given sanctuary. Remy aged with grace. His steps slowed, his muzzle whitened. Cold weather stiffened his joints, and he no longer chased Ashra through the fields like before. But his eyes remained bright, and his loyalty never waned. Thomas built a ramp for the porch so Remy could climb it with ease. He gave him softer bedding, warm broth on colder nights, and quiet company as they both watched time slip past like leaves on the creek. Then, one morning in early spring, Thomas found Remy beneath the oak tree, lying peacefully, breathless. He hadn't cried out, hadn't struggled. He had simply gone. Ashra was already there, sitting beside the shepherd's body, her tail curled around her feet, her eyes unblinking. Thomas sank to his knees. He buried Remy beneath the great oak, in the very spot where the dog had loved to nap in summer. He placed a smooth stone above the grave, carved simply with a name and the word, Protector. Ashra lay by the grave for 3 nights straight. Then she came back to the house and resumed her place in the chair. Nothing needed to be said. James and Nora visited more often after that. The ranch needed more hands, and Thomas, now nearing 75, was slower, stiffer, and grateful for the help. Nora, all legs and curiosity, adored the animals. She followed Ashra at a respectful distance, learning her rhythms. In time, the Bobcat began to tolerate her nearness, then her touch, then her laughter. "She trusts me," Nora whispered once, running a hand along Ashra's back. Thomas smiled. "She trusts who you are." One snowy afternoon, Nora sketched Ashra and Remy from a photograph taken years ago. Her drawing captured them side by side in the chair, winter pressing against the windows, fire glowing behind them. She titled it, "The Ones Who Chose Each Other." Thomas framed it and hung it over the fireplace. The Conservation Center reached out again the following year, this time not for observation, but to ask if they could name a program after the bond between Ashra and Remy, a new educational initiative about interspecies empathy and conservation ethics. Thomas agreed, on one condition, that it be taught with humility. They weren't trying to teach anyone, he said. They were just being. When Ashra grew old, it happened quickly. One winter, her steps slowed. Her time in the woods grew shorter. Her appetite waned. She slept more. Sometimes Thomas would find her sitting for hours by the window, watching the horizon as if waiting for something unseen. And then, one final evening, with snow whispering against the glass and the fire glowing low, Ashra curled into her chair, rested her head on the armrest, and closed her eyes. Thomas sat beside her. He said nothing, just rested his hand gently on her back. Hope, the rescue dog he'd adopted 2 years earlier, lay on the floor, watching silently. That night, Ashra passed in her sleep, peaceful, whole, home. Thomas buried her beside Remy, under the oak. He placed another stone, this one with her name and the word, Wildheart, and between them, on a small plaque of bronze, he added only, Friends Without Boundaries. Years passed. The ranch became known locally as Sanctuary Hill, not because of any official designation, but because everyone understood what had been born there. Children came to visit, walking quietly past the oak tree, leaving feathers, drawings, and pine cones by the stones. Hope became a guardian in her own right. Nora, now a young adult, began writing articles about Ashra and Remy, blending science with storytelling. Her voice was soft, but her words powerful. And Thomas? He grew older, but never bitter. He spent his mornings on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the woods. Sometimes he would see a spotted figure pass between trees, a flash of yellow eyes, a shadow on snow. Sometimes he believed it was Ashra's kin. Sometimes he believed it was Ashra herself. On the final page of his old leather-bound journal, Thomas wrote, "It started with a storm. It ended with a family I didn't know I needed. Not by blood, not by law, but by choice. And that's the kind that lasts." On the 10th anniversary of Where Loyalty Meets the Wild, a new documentary aired across North America. It was narrated by Nora Granger. The final scene showed the wind through the pines, the graves under the oak, and a young bobcat lying beside a new shepherd pup on the porch. The screen faded to black with the words, "Sometimes the greatest miracles arrive on 4 paws. They ask for nothing but to be seen."